One of the things I'm going to talk about tonight is rewilding the East, and getting to go for a walk in the woods here with John beforehand really made me feel like I knew what I was talking about in rewilding the East. Family homesteaded in New Mexico over 100 years ago, and I admit to being a Western chauvinist, thinking that the only real wilderness was in the West. But when I started working for the Wilderness Society and coming back east and hiking in Shenandoah National Park and other places, I was just amazed at how wild the country seemed. I'd be hiking in Shenandoah National Park and what seemed like primeval forest, and here would be a stone wall and an old stone chimney and that sort of thing. And I wonder, wow, is this from one of my relatives who were here in the 1700s? But much of Shenandoah was farmland until the 1930s, and so I began to realize just how fast things came back. And in many ways, places like Shenandoah and the National Forest in the southern Appalachians are wilder today than they were 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. This area right here is much wilder than it was 50 years ago. And so I think that's something for us to keep in mind, is that we can help things turn around and change and rewild. We really need to be thinking about this now, because Earth is in an unprecedented situation. Not for 65,000 years ago, since a comet wiped out the dinosaurs, have we seen the extinction rates we're seeing today around the world. We are in the middle of a mass extinction, and that mass extinction is caused by one thing, one species, and that's us. And it's our overpopulation and overconsumption that is driving the takeover of the whole Earth and the endangerment of species from the poles to the equator, from the bottom of the ocean to the heights of the atmosphere. A figure that I think is really important, and any of you who have studied ecology know it, which is net primary productivity, which means all the sunlight being converted through photosynthesis by plants into biomass. Well, right now, human beings are consuming over 42% of the net primary productivity every year. We're using up nearly half of it, and we're only one species of many. I'm 64 years old. I have seen Earth's population triple in my lifetime. Triple. Earth did not get 1 billion people until 1804. We're at 7 billion today. And the United Nations, under their moderate growth patterns, say that by 2050 we're going to have 9.2 billion. And others say that we could have 12 billion by 2050. So we keep expanding our population like this. How much net primary productivity do we take away from all the other species on Earth? And I think it's really important to think of who we are and how we're related to everybody else. The key insight Charles Darwin had 150 years ago is that we're all related. All life forms are cousins. We're descended from a last common ancestor. And so that makes us cousins. We're all in a neighborhood, an ecological community. We need to be good neighbors. We need to recognize the ovenbird and the shagbark hickory and all the other things living out there as our neighbors. And we need to learn how to be good neighbors. And one way of doing that is sharing space on this earth with everybody else. As I see it, what's behind the mass extinction are 7 different kinds of ecological wounds. And one of them is overkill. We take too much out of the oceans. Shark populations have dropped 90% in the last 10 years because of overfishing. That's just one example. We see we saw the slaughter of the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet here back in the 1800s. There were 2 billion passenger pigeons, and they were wiped out in less than 2 generations after the Civil War. 2 billion birds. At the same time, 50 million bison on the Great Plains were wiped out. Another one of these ecological wounds is habitat destruction. The amount of the Amazon rainforest that's being cleared every year. The amount of forest that was cleared in the eastern United States in the 1800s, for example. The way we dug up and plowed the tall grass prairie. And then there's habitat fragmentation. It's not just converting natural vegetation, it's the way we break habitat up so species can't move on their normal migration patterns. And then all our activities help exotic species to move around and invade. Things like the zebra mussel or kudzu that you all know about in the southeast. And then we upset ecological and evolutionary processes like pollination, like river floods and hydrology. And one of the most important ones we upset is predation. And I'll talk about that later, but when we get rid of cougars and other big carnivores, we cause ecosystems to crumble. And then there's pollution with biocides. So many of our pollutants affect wildlife more than they affect us. That was the theme of Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring. And then the seventh one, and one we didn't even know about 20 years ago, is global weirding, or greenhouse gas pollution. That, 20 years ago I was talking about mass extinction and all these problems. And that was before we realized just what we were doing with greenhouse gases and how strange we were making everything and how we were upsetting the living conditions for so many other species. And so these 7 different kind of ecological wounds work together to cause the loss of thousands and thousands of species every year. John Terborg at Duke University is one of the world's experts on the extinction crisis, and he talks about what a percentage we may lose in the next 50 years. But behind these 7 ecological wounds is the human population explosion. The way we keep growing and growing and growing. And what the story of humankind has been is that our population has grown and it has displaced other species. The more people there are, the fewer there are of other species. We take what they need to live. For 50,000 years, it seems like human beings have been converting Earth and all the other animals and plants into more and more human beings. That's fundamentally what it's behind. I have a book coming out in a month or so called Man Swarm, which goes into this and how the human population explosion really leads to the mass extinction event. And Fred and Alice have been big supporters of my work on that. But what I want to talk about is something positive, how to make it better. I mean, my generation is handing your generation a bad deck of cards. But you can make it better. And I'm spending the rest of my life to try to make it better too. And what I want to talk about is how we rewild the East. For some 20 years now, I've been talking about a North American wildlands network that's anchored in the 4 continental wildways. And this came about through the work of John Terborg at Duke, Michael Soule, and others who said that there really are 2 major ecological problems we're facing. One is this fragmentation, where there are no longer big enough national parks or wilderness areas outside the Arctic or the Amazon to provide full range of habitat for different species. And with fragmentation, we keep them from moving back and forth. And so what we need to do is to protect the linkages, the wildways, the landscape connectivity between protected areas so animals can move around. And we particularly need that now with climate change so that species can move up mountains, they can move north. Because if we fragment the landscape, they can't do that. And then the second thing that Terborg and others pointed out is the loss of large carnivores, like cougars back east here, or wolves in the west. And when that happens, the research shows that ecosystems begin to crumble. And so this idea of a North American wildlands network, or rewilding, was a way to bring these things back into the whole continent. In other words, we need to do conservation on the level of the 180 acres in this preserve here, but we also need to do it on the level of the whole North American continent. And so the North American Wildlands Network is anchored in 4 continental wildways. One is the Arctic Boreal, stretching from Canada to Labrador, and then there's the Pacific, going from south central Alaska down through California, the spine of the continent from the Brooks Range in Alaska, Mackenzie's in the Yukon, down the Canadian and U.S. Rockies into the Sierra Madre of Mexico, and then the Appalachians from the Maritimes of Canada down to northern Georgia. And most people can listen to that and say, yeah, I see how that's possible, but then when I get to the last one, they sort of start chuckling. And a lot of people don't see how we can rewild the Appalachians. It's just too built up, there's too many people, it's too fragmented, there's not enough public land, there aren't big enough roadless areas, there aren't very many national parks. There are all these problems with rewilding the East. But as it became clear to me again today as I walked around the little preserve here with John, the East is different than the West in that the East is much more resilient. Things come back faster. I know some clear cuts in northern New Mexico that were cut in the late 1960s, and they still don't have trees in them. But a lot of this was farmland 50, 60, 70 years ago. It's coming back. And also the East is so much more productive. It produces many, many more deer on a square mile than the West does. And so there are real potentials for, I think, rewilding the East. There's a lot of history about it, too. How many of you have ever walked on any part of the Appalachian Trail? Okay, well, good. Benton Mackay, who was one of the first landscape architects and regional planners, proposed the Appalachian Trail in the early 1920s as a footpath all along the Appalachians from Georgia to Maine. In 1926, he read an article by a forester out in New Mexico by the name of Aldo Leopold that talked about establishing wilderness areas, places that would be roadless, that would prohibit automobiles, that would have no logging and this sort of thing. And Mackay suddenly thought of his Appalachian Trail idea as a string connecting pearls of wilderness all along the Appalachians. And in the 1920s, Benton Mackay called for restoring the Great Eastern Forest. And so there's nothing at all radical about saying rewild the East. Benton Mackay, the father of the Appalachian Trail, was thinking about this in the 1920s. But even he was preceded. There was a strong movement in western North Carolina around the turn of the last century, 1900, to establish a large national park in eastern North Carolina. That eventually turned into an effort to set up national forests. All the national forests were in the west, but in 1911, the so-called Weeks Act passed, which gave the Forest Service authority to purchase lands in the eastern United States to protect their watershed as national forest. And that's how the Pisgah and Nantahala and other national forests out here were established, was through the Weeks Act in 1911. And then there was the effort to establish the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. But even before all of that, in the 1880s and 1890s, the Chamber of Commerce of New York City, concerned about the water supply from the Hudson River, proposed a state park around the Adirondacks in northern New York that would be forever wild in order to protect that watershed. And in the New York State Constitution in the 1890s, it declares that all state lands in the Adirondacks will be forever wild. Well, more and more land was acquired by New York and the Adirondacks, and they developed a wilderness system modeled on the U.S. wilderness system. So there have been a lot of efforts to do this sort of thing back east. The Southern Appalachian Forest Council, SAFC, out of Asheville, is one of my inspirations for what I'm talking about, because a few years ago they came out with a proposal for a number of core reserves throughout the southern and central Appalachians to do it. And so I think it's entirely possible, but the thing lacking, the most important impediment to us rewilding the East, is the lack of the vision to do it, thinking that it can't be done, that it's too much to ask for, that it's too far gone. Well, this tells me it's not too far gone, and that if we have the vision and the will, we can do some extraordinary things in the eastern United States. And in doing so, we can really save what's important to the landscape out here and to all the things that live on it. And so I want to talk about the Appalachian Wild Way. This idea of the string of pearls from Maine down to northern Georgia. One of the problems we face is that there's relatively little federal land. Yeah, there are a lot of national forest lands in the southern Appalachians, but in some parts of it, it's sort of broken up. And so that's one thing we need to get over. And that's a real key, important point to do. About 25 years ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came out with a study on restoring the eastern cougar. How many of you have heard of that or have seen it? Wow, really? I'm impressed. And they came up with about 20 different spots in the southeastern United States as possible cougar recovery areas, but nothing ever became of it. I think the number one thing we need in the East is the cougar, is the big cat. My friend Dave Mayer, who was head of the Florida Panther Recovery Program for the state of Florida, a real cougar expert, later conservation biologist at the University of Kentucky, was unfortunately killed a couple of years ago in a plane crash while following radio-collared black bears in northern Florida. Dave Mayer said that the most important animal missing from the East is the cougar, much more so than a wolf or anything else. It's the cougar is the great regulator of prey species in the East. John Terborg has done research in Venezuela showing that when jaguars disappeared from certain areas, that the whole ecosystem began to break down, that trees didn't reproduce themselves. And one of the problems we have in the East today is a massive overpopulation of deer. Some of my friends from the University of Wisconsin and elsewhere who have studied this, an area that are closed off to deer, and areas that have deer, areas in Wisconsin where wolves have come back, and areas where they haven't come back. It's an extraordinary difference in the understory vegetation and the wildflowers and the forbs and other things in these places. Where there are no wolves or mountain lions, and this overpopulation of deer, the wildflowers have very low diversity, very low abundance, but where they are being preyed on, there's a lot more diversity, and it comes back reasonably quickly. There are seeds in the ground yet. And so I believe with Dave Mayer that the most important thing we can do for the health of the eastern forest is to bring back mountain lions. Now, a lot of people are afraid of mountain lions. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, next to a 40,000-acre wilderness area, the Sandia Wilderness. I see mountain lion tracks on the trail where I walk just about every day. And let me tell you, here in the east, coyotes and black bears are a heck of a lot more dangerous than mountain lions are. There's nothing really to worry about with mountain lions. And one nice thing about mountain lions is that they eat coyotes. And so if you don't like coyotes, if you think there's a coyote problem in the east, well, mountain lions will help take care of that. The whole thing about cats and dogs, well, the mountain lion is the big cat. And we'll deal with that. But it's an important thing to overcome. The Rewilding Institute, one of the things we do is publish plans for recovery of wildlife on a continental basis and doing brochures for them. We did one on the wolf. The next one we're going to do is the cougar. We're going to have a lot of emphasis on the east. And I'll tell you a little later how you can be sure to get a copy of that. And we're going to be working with a number of groups in the Appalachians on how to do that. But I think that's a really essential part of it. And the interesting thing is that in the eastern United States, cougars can blend in very, very well. They are very secretive. There could be a cougar out here and nobody would ever notice it. You would see some tracks on the trails, but that would be it. They really do keep out of sight. And so even smaller areas in the east, I think, have habitat for cougars. But we need to do a lot now because there are some real threats if we don't begin to rewild the east. We are seeing population increases in rural areas, more houses, more starter castles, more subdivisions, more roads, more fragmentation, breaking up the landscape so animals can't move back and forth. We are seeing, because of the overpopulation of deer, a deterioration of the forest. We've seen a lot of forests grow up, but now they're big enough that loggers want them. And so we could begin to lose that 100 or 50 years of growth. There are a bunch of other problems that we face as well. As land becomes fragmented, land acquisition becomes harder. With climate change, we're going to see things just get weirder and weirder, and so that's one reason we need big connected reserves. We're going to see a loss of quality hunting because of the deterioration overall of the forest. And so what do we do about all of this? What are some workable steps for rewilding the East? When the Weeks Act was passed in 1911, it basically told the Forest Service to draw lines around areas on the ground that would be purchase units. And then they were authorized to buy private lands within those purchase units to make the national forest. Well, if you look at a map of national forests in the eastern United States, you see a lot of white spots. Those are the private lands that are still within the exterior boundary of the national forest. We need a real program to begin to acquire more of those, to block up the national forest in the east like we have in the west. And for that, we need the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was a fund set up by Congress years ago that takes the money, supposedly, from offshore oil and gas leasing and puts it into land acquisition. The only trouble is that Congress has not been appropriating that. And with the Looney Tunes now running the House of Representatives, they aren't going to. And so we need a real push on to fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund and make it a priority to acquire in-holdings within Eastern National Forest. So we begin to block up more and more public acres in big chunks. This is a really key thing for us to do. We also need to protect all the roadless areas on the national forest along the Appalachians and elsewhere in North Carolina, and roadless areas on national wildlife refuges and that sort of thing. I remember back in the 1970s when we had the fight for the Eastern Wilderness Areas Act. And I got a lot of people in New Mexico to write letters for the Eastern Wilderness Areas Act. But the Forest Service said there was no wilderness back east, but the people here said there was. And we got a number of national forest wilderness areas established here. One of the biggest wilderness proposals in the eastern United States is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There's 500,000, 500,000 acres of wilderness proposed by the Park Service in the Smokies. But it's never been passed by Congress. Now, Jesse Helms was a major reason for it not being passed, but the last I heard, Jesse Helms wasn't around. And so we need a real push from folks in North Carolina and Tennessee to designate a huge wilderness area in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is the wildest place left by far outside of the Adirondacks in the east. And so we need to protect these roadless areas. We need to establish more wilderness areas and wildlife refuges and national parks where we have the opportunity. And then we need to get serious about making some bigger areas, about closing some dirt roads. I have looked at maps of the Eastern National Forest and eastern roadless areas and wilderness areas, and in many cases there's just this little dinky dirt road that separates two areas. I wrote a book some 25 years ago called The Big Outside, where I looked at all the large roadless areas left in the United States. And there were something like 328 roadless areas in the West of 100,000 acres or more. But there were only 30 in the eastern United States. And there weren't even that many over 50,000 acres. But with closing a few hundred miles of dirt road or jeep trails or off-road vehicle trails, we could have some very big roadless areas along the Appalachians and elsewhere in the southeast and northeast and Midwest. It's doable. All we have to do is have the vision to ask for it, to think about it, to work for it, to say, hey, this is what we need to have. And a really good example of how this kind of vision works is I was working for the Wilderness Society as their chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. in the late 1970s. And the Forest Service did an inventory of all their roadless areas around the United States. And we conservation groups played it reasonable. There were 61 million acres of roadless areas, but we only asked to protect 35 million acres. And this was when Jimmy Carter was president. He was a friend of ours. But Jimmy Carter and the Forest Service proposed only 15 million acres to be protected out of 61, and we felt like we'd gotten a shaft. And that's why I started Earth First. And the first thing we did when we started Earth First was to say all national forest roadless areas should be protected. And the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society and other groups laughed at us and said, we can't get that. Well, do you know what happened? 20 years later, at the end of Bill Clinton's administration, in January of 2001, Bill Clinton and the chief of the Forest Service proposed the roadless area rule that protected all the roadless areas on the national forest. So 20 years after a few nutcases who started Earth First asked to do that, and none of the conservation groups would back it, we got it. Now, the George Bush administration did everything they could to try to end the roadless rule, but we still have it. And so that shows what asking for your vision gets you. You just might get it. But if you don't ask for it, if you're shy, if you're embarrassed to speak out to say what we really should have, like cougars back in the East, like bigger roadless areas and all, you will not get it. I can guarantee you that. But if you have the vision and you have the courage and you have the love for the land and other wildlife, you just might get it. And you will change the world to be a much better place than it is. We have to really try to control the off-road vehicle plague. I mean, they are everywhere now. They didn't exist 30 years ago. They weren't a problem. But now they're everywhere. The only people who like off-road vehicles are those who ride them and those who sell them. And the rest of us find them really obnoxious. But we aren't as loud as they are. And so we need to get better organized and work with the National Forest and state lands and other places to restrict off-road vehicles to designated routes where they can't go off-road. And I say that, I'm 64 years old. I used to be a really tough guy. But I had a very bad accident 10 years ago and hurt my back. And I haven't been able to backpack for 10 years. Right now, I can't walk more than an hour at a time. And so, I'm sorry, I still want to control vehicles on the public lands. Just because I might not be able to walk 10 miles anymore doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And after I give this talk, my back is going to be killing me so much, I'm really going to feel it. But that's not the issue. The issue is what's good for the land and what's good for the things that live there. We really need to protect the little connections between these clusters of core complexes. And let me tell you that coming down from Maine, there are a number of areas where we can really put together big clusters of roadless areas and wilderness areas. The first one is Baxter State Park in Maine. And the woman who owned Burt's Bees has just bought something like 100,000 acres in Maine that she once established as a Maine Woods National Park next to Baxter State Park. And so we could see a big wilderness complex come together up there in northern Maine. The White Mountain National Forest and the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont and New Hampshire have a lot of roadless areas. That's another complex. The Adirondack State Park in New York, over 2 million acres of state-designated wilderness areas. And there's one patch of 50,000 acres of old-growth forest there. It's quite extraordinary. And then north central Pennsylvania has a lot of state parks, state hunting and fishing lands, including some large roadless areas that I've hiked in. I saw bobcat in one area. With a little bit of work there, dirt roads could be closed and on. We could begin to block up big areas. In West Virginia, the Monongahela National Forest, Cranberry Wilderness Area, Western Virginia, the National Forest, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. There's a big complex of federal land there that with these steps I've suggested, we could create a big cluster of roadless areas and wilderness areas. And then, of course, the southern Appalachians, which are the cream of the crop. I mean, still some significant old-growth forests in the Smokies and Joyce-Kilmer. Have any of you been to Joyce-Kilmer? I mean, those trees there just blew my socks off. I could not believe it when I went there a few years ago. What an extraordinary place. And so there are all those places that we can start with as these clusters of wilderness areas and cores and then begin to work on the connections between them. And we really can begin to rewild the East to finally get to Benton MacKay's vision from the 1920s. Isn't that something? That some old guy that looked like Ichabod Crane and never married and was just this odd loner came up with this idea in the 1920s of the Appalachian Trail and how it should link wilderness areas all along the Appalachians. I mean, what an extraordinary person that was to have that sort of vision then. And we need to follow up on it. We need to realize Benton MacKay's vision, and we can do it. I mean, these are not that difficult of steps if the public gets behind them, if enough people get behind them. It's not the whole public. I mean, look at the Tea Party. There aren't that many people, but they make so much noise that we think that there are millions of them. And so we need to make our voices known on rewilding the East. You know, there are beavers down here. Fred Standback and I are going to swipe a couple tonight after my talk and put them on his farm. But the comeback of the beaver is just amazing here in the East. And the comeback of the black bear is really extraordinary. So the potential is here. How many of you have read Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac? Good, because I think that's the most important conservation book ever written. And the first sentence in it, in many ways, is the most important one. It says, there are those who can live without wild things and those who cannot. How many of you are cannots? Good, because I certainly am. I have no desire to live without wild things. But unless we get active with a vision and with passion and really trying to change things, we're going to be living with fewer and fewer wild things. And we need to recognize that. As I said, the key insight of Charles Darwin is that we're all related. We're all cousins, those wild things and us. And I think if we look at ethics, that ethics all grows out of being a good neighbor. How do you live in a neighborhood with mutual respect? And if we look at ecosystems or ecological communities as neighborhoods, we recognize that the critters out there, the ovenbirds, the beavers, everything else, are our neighbors. And that either we live in that neighborhood or we pass through it. We want to be good neighbors. And that's the basis of Aldo Leopold's land ethic, as being a plain member and citizen of the land community, being a good neighbor. And I think there is nothing more neighborly than rewilding, than helping wild places come back, by helping wildlife come back. You know, one of my passions is the English language as a writer, and I really am interested in Old English. And if we go back in Old English and look for the beginning of the word wilderness, we find the word wildeornus, which means home of wild beast. A wildeor in Old English was an animal with a will of its own. Will. Dior. Dior meant animal. Now it just means deer. But in Old English, dior was the general word for animal, but it was replaced by the Norman French beast and then the Latin animal. And then we finally got back to wildlife only 150 years ago, was when that word was created. So wildeors, I think, are what my passion is. They are wild things. And wildeornus is the home of wild beasts, or wilderness, wild land. And the important thing in understanding the word wild is that it means self-willed. In other words, a wildeor is not willed by us. Our will is not imposed on a wildeor. It's not a tame or domesticated animal. It's a wild animal. It lives under its own will. And it seems like we human beings, whenever we've come into a place, we've been offended by the wildeors, and we've killed them off, whether they're wolves or bison or mountain lions or what have you. And now I think as we've become more mature, we've learned more about how the wild world works, we have a chance to expand our ethics to include wildeors, to include wild things. And wild things it's so important, I think, for human beings today, when we're so powerful and so many of us, to be able to step back and not impose our will on everything. And for thousands of years, that's what we've done. We've imposed our will on the land and on other living things. We have tried to be the conqueror of everything. And it's time for us to grow up and have a little responsibility, a little humility, to be able to pull back, to do some self-breaking, not to have this overweening gall that we've had for thousands of years. It's time to recognize our neighbors, and it's time to recognize that we be good neighbors. And I can't think of any way to be a better neighbor, a better way to show some humility towards the magnificence and the glory of creation than to help the East rewild itself. We aren't going to rewild the East ourselves. We're going to help it rewild itself. Just like that patch of forest is rewilding. Just like the beavers down there are rewilding. Just like cougars will rewild if they're given half a chance in the Appalachians, and Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, and Okefenokee, and other places. And so rewilding the East is our way to really become better people, to grow up, to become good neighbors, to become ethical. And so how can we lose? We get wild things back, we get wild places back, and we become better for it. So thank you very much.